The fiasco between South Korea and Japan over the water discharge from the Fukushima nuclear power plant is inevitable. Japan's indifference to its fishery unions and South Korea's appeal to the International Tribunal for Land and Sea have aggravated the situation. But could this aggravation be indicative of the cold rivalry maintained by South Korea and Japan since the end of World War II? In today's segment, we have Duncan Bartlett joining us. Mr. Bartlett is the editor of Asian Affairs and a former BBC correspondent in Asia. Currently, he is a research associate at the China Institute SOAS, University of London. So, to the first question, for the past few weeks, the fiasco between South Korea and Japan seems unavoidable over the discharge of radioactive waters from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. Do you see that the situation between South Korea and Japan is being exaggerated as a result of the old rivalry that has always remained between the two countries since the end of the Second World War? Or is it just another speculation being driven to make the situations look aggravated?
Well, you're absolutely right that over the past few weeks there's been a big diplomatic disagreement over this between Japan, South Korea and China, and it's affecting international relations right across Asia, and it has global implications too. But of course, the problem hasn't just emerged in the past few weeks. It goes back 10 years to March 2011 when a terrible tidal wave came across eastern Japan and affected the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Still a lot of cleaning up to do on that. The price tag to Japan is something like 200 billion US dollars equivalent. That's more than the government of Japan spends in a year. In fact, it's something like double the annual budget of the Japanese government just for this year alone. So one of the most expensive things is to try to work out what to do with the water which has been affected by radiation. It goes through a complex filtration process, and that removes most of the radioactive elements, but does it remove them all? Probably not. A few remain, and some of the ones that remain are deemed to be harmful to humans if they're taken in large doses, and that's the cause for concern. I have to say it's not just a cause for concern in Japan's Asian neighbours like South Korea and Taiwan and China. There are many people in Japan who are also worried about it. The owner of the Fukushima plant, Tepco, says that it's run out of space to store all this water. It's been putting them into tanks, and that means it's going to have to release them into the sea. But it's a huge amount, more than 1 million tons of radioactive water. That's enough to fill something like 500 swimming pools. Frankly, I'm not surprised that people are concerned. And the other issue here is that people didn't really trust Tepco when it gave reassurances when the disaster first happened. In fact, it tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation. That's dented trust. On top of that, we have the difficult diplomatic situation between Japan and China and South Korea anyway. So I think as well as environmental concerns, there's no doubt in my mind that politics is also playing a part.
All right. So the second question is, China also has some shared interest and concerns over Japan's decision and has time and again called out the act. Do you see this as China's motive to thrive back at Japan, given the close ally that the latter shares with the US?
Well, you can't be surprised that people in China are worried when they hear that a neighbouring country is about to send out millions of tons of radioactive water into the sea that will wash up onto their shores. Of course they're concerned, and that's reflected in what the government's been saying. Having said that, I think that the Chinese might have a reason to exaggerate the problem, and that's because of the historical rivalry, if we can put it that way, between China and Japan. Back in the 20th century, Japan invaded China, and there's still resentment about that within China. Of course, Japan and China have very different political systems. Japan is a multi-party democracy. It's an ally of the United States, whereas China, of course, is still a one-party authoritarian state. And that means that the Chinese quite often send out negative messages about Japan through their foreign ministry. This is another example of something where they found something to criticize.
Okay. So Zhao Lijian, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, tweeted with a parody of the iconic Great Way of Kanagwa, with the nuclear waste being poured into the sea. How do you read this interpretation of China?
Well, the most famous picture that's ever been made by a Japanese artist is Hokusai's picture of the Great Wave, which was made about 200 years ago. It's a terrific icon. And the Japanese don't take kindly to it being used by the Chinese, their rivals, in this negative way, associating the Great Wave with Japan sending nuclear radioactive water onto the seas, into the seas and onto the shores of other nations. I think it's a bit of an insult to their great work of art. Having said that, this image of the Great Wave has been used in so many different situations, on t-shirts, on mugs, even on underwear over the years, that I don't think anybody can think of it really as being a sacred image which can't be touched. But I suppose it's a question of the Chinese hitting out against the Japanese on something which they're quite sensitive about, actually, because it was, of course, a tsunami, a tidal wave, which caused the damage in eastern Japan, which led to the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown. It wasn't something that the Japanese caused deliberately. It was an act of nature. It was a natural disaster which caused it. And that great wave was a warning from history about the implications of these terrible natural disasters in Asia.
Moving on to the next question, South Korea has filed a lawsuit in the International Tribunal of Land and Sea, with Russia and Taiwan joining in support. While the US is closing seals with Taiwan, the present scenario does look very chaotic and unpleasant. Would you agree to it?
So let's say something about the relationship between South Korea and Japan. It's not in a good state at the moment. You would think that actually South Korea and Japan have much in common. They're both allies of the United States, they're multi-party democracies, their economic systems are actually quite similar. But again, there's resentment over historical issues about the time when South Korea was occupied by Japan, going back many decades now. But still, these are live issues in the minds of some South Koreans, and they have been using the courts and lawsuits to try to get the Japanese to pay them money. So when South Korea now files another lawsuit, this time at the International Tribunal of the Land and Sea, you can see why there might be some tired sighing in Japan that the South Koreans are trying to take legal action. I think actually, if you look at the number of countries which are likely to support this South Korean claim, it's probably fairly small. The key thing is that Japan says that it has sufficient scientific grounds to say that this planned release of water is safe. What the Koreans though is that they say that what the Koreans want though is the involvement of the International Atomic Energy Agency to absolutely double check and verify that there is no further problem. Because if the water goes from Fukushima in Japan, it could easily wash up in South Korea.
Speaking of the scientific background, which Japan has time and again repeated, the US State Department has also come out in support of Japan, stating that it has followed all major protocols before such a decision was taken. Do you find any strategic motive behind the support, given that we all know that the water would still contain high level of tritium?
I haven't been able to go through all the scientific data to be absolutely sure whether or not water that contains tritium is still a risk to human health, or indeed to the fishes and other creatures that live in the seas. But you see, when the US State Department takes the side of Japan, that's not really a great big surprise, is it? Because Japan and the US are very close allies. The Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga was the first foreign national leader to be invited for face-to-face talks with Joe Biden in the White House in April 2021. That was a big honor for Japan. Japan and America are doing a lot of business together. They're security allies. So you could imagine, couldn't you, that in China or South Korea, they might say, well, of course the Americans have supported Japan on this issue. It's surely a political motivation that they've been driven by, not because that they think that Japan is not presenting an environmental risk to its neighbors. Why would the Americans care? That's what the Chinese might say. And they also might say that certainly under Mr. Trump, it didn't look as though the United States of America was taking its environmental responsibilities particularly seriously, having pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and so on. But under Mr. Biden, of course, there's been an emphasis on America working with other countries on environmental issues, particularly over climate change. So you can see how this is going to be interpreted in different ways in Beijing and in Washington.
All right. So, to the last question, as an ecological concern, the release of waters from the Fukushima nuclear power plant will have adversaries for fisheries. Japan is ignorant of the demands being raised by the fishery unions there. How would you explain Japan's decision on the whole scenario?
Well, a lot of people who are involved in the fishing industry in Japan are very worried about this because their livelihoods depend on being able to catch fish from clean waters. And even if people who are fishing off the shores of Japan are convinced that the fish are not contaminated by radiation, will they be able to give that reassurance to customers, including customers in China and in South Korea? It's going to be very difficult, isn't it, after all the publicity that this has generated? Actually, of course, it's the people in Japan who should be worried most of all. There's enormous enthusiasm for eating fish in sashimi or in sushi in Japan. 1 in 7 of the world's sea creatures gets eaten by a Japanese person each year. So this could be a major economic and business issue, as well as being something which is causing international diplomatic concern.
All right. So I guess we can wrap up now. We've completed all the questions, and I hope
Great.
you liked the questions.